and welcome back. Hope you had enough time to grab a cup of coffee or a cup of tea. So we're about to hear from the ATO and the Fair Work Ombudsman on COVID-19, a government perspective. Today we have Frances Southward, Assistant Commissioner, Super Business Service Centre, Client Account Services at the ATO, and Michael Clark, Executive Director, Customer Services, Compliance and Enforcement Group. Frances, let's hear a little bit about you, and then Michael, we'd also love to hear your story as well, if that's okay. Over to you, Frances.
Thanks, Fiona. Hi, everybody. So as we heard there, I work at the Australian Taxation Office, and I predominantly focus on service delivery, so frontline staff taking calls from the community and outbound calls as well. Obviously, this year, with a number of government stimulus measures that the ATO has been responsible for administering, I think my staffing levels have grown by about 2,500. But I think we'll get into that a little bit later. I also look after things like support functions, training, recruitment, and other support elements for our service delivery staff.
Thanks, Frances. Michael.
Michael Clark, I'm the Executive Director of Customer Services. Been an interesting 2020 for us and for me. So up until the end of August, I was running our technology side of the Fair Work Ombudsman, so as a CIO, and switch gears into customer services, as I said, at the end of August. So have experienced both sides of the equation for managing through COVID-19 in terms of supporting our frontline services and our people from a technology perspective, and then working with our teams in terms of what we've been doing and providing through frontline service delivery, dispute resolution and other activities. So yeah, happy to talk to some of those as we walk through.
Fantastic, and thank you very much. So let's start by talking about how your respective agencies have traversed or are traversing, because let's face it, COVID-19 has not been declared closed, especially with regard to technology, staff, risk, and the whole gamut that you need to look after. So, Michael, maybe we could start with you.
Yeah, sure. So, as you said, Fiona, it's been an interesting year and continues on. I think that the great news this week has been for our Melbourne people, getting some easing of restrictions. 2020 has posed challenges all the way through. So we came into the year dealing with additional demand from bushfires and people that were impacted. So we support employees and employers in relation to wages, conditions of employment, and those elements. And certainly, started 2020 tackling through some of the bushfire challenges. Through COVID-19 has been a really big shift in terms of demand. Frances mentioned new services and commitments from government have also impacted. So one of the common themes for both Frances and myself is around some of the JobKeeper elements that have been announced and delivered through government. So we've seen extraordinary increases in demand for services and information through our website, through our phone services, through other mediums, as well as having to try and relocate a significant portion of our people, as close to 100% as we get, working remotely. And that's still a significant factor for our people that are in Melbourne and in Sydney in the main, but many others have transitioned back. So a huge amount of challenges that we've had to tackle from a technology, people, process, changes in risk profiles, etc. So can dive into any and all of those as we progress the conversation.
Okay, Frances, and we will come back to you, Michael, and dive in a little bit deeper. Frances, can you share a little bit about the tax office as well?
Sure. So if we think about the normal tax office cycle, we have this big thing called tax time, and that hits us in the beginning of July. And if we think about our traditional workflow, we manage about 85% of our service delivery work, so our calls and other interactions in that 3.5-month period, 4-month period. For us, what COVID meant and the administration of a number of job measures We had the early release of superannuation benefits that people would have heard a lot about in the media. We had JobMaker, and we had another big measure called the cash flow boost that we're all, suddenly having to manage. So we actually transitioned about 2,500 people that normally do other work in the ATO straight to taking phone calls for clients. So imagine in some of your own organisations getting some of your directors who might do investigations or push papers around the office suddenly actually having to take calls and talk to clients. So it was a huge, not just a physical challenge, but actually a really big cultural challenge for us. And some context, we took from March, we were taking 100,000 calls a day on top of our normal work. So suddenly for us to actually grow to that scale was, kind of horrific, what kept us up at night. But it's amazing, like many big organisations, actually like many organisations, it's amazing what crisis does. It makes us suddenly possess these superhuman strengths and we can almost kind of do anything. Interestingly for us, we brought forward all of our tax time recruitment by 4 months, which again saw our workforce increase by about another 2,500 on top of that. And, the sorts of challenges we had was, we were dealing with people who were in severe crisis themselves. So not only was our workforce, suddenly being asked to step up and administer something new, so learn something new, but equally they were often going through things themselves, personal challenges, personal experiences. And then they also had to talk day in, day out with people who equally were really suffering within the community. So there are a number of areas that, really for us were a big focus for that period. Interestingly, some of the things that nearly brought us undone. So we, similarly to Michael, had to really think about work from home, and from an ATO perspective, we'd never done that for contact centres in the past. So we quickly did. It's amazing, again, what a crisis does. All those risks that we call out and say we can't do it because it's too risky, suddenly we actually needed to step through those, which was fantastic. But some of the logistic challenges we had to face, we suddenly had to, if you think about how our telephony queues actually needed to stream to our individuals, working from home, they needed mobile phones for us to actually stream into. We needed to actually purchase double the call trunks that we normally have. So all those small things, whilst we're all off, doing the high level, quick, what's the strategy look like? What's our training? It was computers, it was phones. It was those small things that equally you kind of don't think about when you're shifting 20,000 plus people to a work from home solution. So, again, it gave us great leveraging power. So now it's about what's next. But, that was before we even thought about what actually do we need to think about from the mental health or the well-being of our people suddenly taking calls from desperate people. And the different requirements that actually we need to think differently about. Using the same old solutions isn't going to solve the new problems. So, yeah.
Some frightening numbers in there, Frances, moving 20,000 people to work from home. I'm very proud that it hasn't made you go grey, so that's brilliant. So maybe we can hear from Michael, because I know Fair Work took a slightly different approach to the Australian Taxation Office. And Michael, can you share your story?
Oh, look, and there's certainly a lot of similarities with Frances. We certainly don't deal with quite the same volume, either of inquiries or people, but we had some similar challenges in terms of incredible increase in load coming to our website. I mean, our website already handles in excess of 17 million visitors a year. We've seen, we saw millions of people coming to the website for coronavirus content, so we had to implement new infrastructure to support that and ensure that was robust and stable. Work from home from a contact center perspective was a similar challenge. We really didn't do that in any meaningful way. We had to recruit new frontline staff and onboard during a pandemic is always an interesting juggle. We also took some opportunities in terms of it's a different risk profile. So when you're managing and leading in a crisis, you need to have services available, and that saw opportunities for us to do a couple of different things. Similar to Francis, we did bring people back from other parts of the organisation to handle frontline inquiries, and we called that our alumni program. So we called alumnus back that had previously been worked in that space, quickly trained them and put them on board handling inquiries. We also deployed a virtual assistant. So we'd stood up a specific coronavirus subsite on our website, and took the opportunity to put a virtual assistant up, which is the first time we've put a virtual assistant on our website. But we did that specifically for coronavirus-related inquiries and engagement. So that's been a really valuable exercise to prove that it is a good service for us, and to help manage and mitigate some of the demand that was coming to us. So, on top of those things, again, it is about supporting our people. So likewise, in terms of moving remotely, what technology did we have available, ramping up, laptops and available technology, making sure people could actually remote from home, and then very much looking at the kind of services that we could make available to our people. So lent heavily on an employee assistance program, with courses, guidance, engagement, on dealing with people that were their own challenges working remotely and things happening in their own family lives, but also what they were getting through in inquiries from people who are in quite desperate or challenging situations. So a real mix of activities focusing on people, process and technology, in a really sudden way. But probably the highlight for me was just the strong levels of engagement and collaboration right across the organisation, I think, and across the Australian Public Service. So what we saw was a huge engagement in what needed to happen, and what needed to be done. And I think some of the most open, collaborative working arrangements that I've seen in my career, which is a testament to people that are doing their best to serve the citizens of the country.
Thanks, Michael. And look, you've both mentioned about the well-being of your staff as being absolutely key. And I know, Francis, when we were talking earlier on, you were talking about how some of the challenges for your people were dealing with incremental calls on suicidal ideation. And I know both of you are working in a highly emotional area where you're talking about people's livelihoods, people's well-being. How did you support your people? I know, Michael, you've mentioned EAP, but suicidal ideation, from our perspective, is that next level. How did you actually support your people through that? Francis, maybe if we could get your thoughts on that, please.
Yeah, sure. And look, I mean, it's a challenging one. We actually have that all year round. COVID saw it increase. But it's something that some of our staff members, definitely in particular areas, actually deal with on a regular basis. So we have a tried and true practice on how we report, what our check-in processes are from an individual's perspective. I get a copy of every single report for anyone in my direct line that has any kind of interaction with a client. Going there, we call the police, we get involved in that way. And again, some of the work that we do administer is dealing with people who are desperate. They are at the absolute point, and the challenge for us as an administrator is that some of those checks and balances are actually law. So actually trying to reason with someone who's quite desperate leads to, sort of statements like, well, that's it, you haven't helped me, this is my next step. And actually thinking differently about how we employ people to actually deal with that on a regular basis. But COVID actually spread that type of interaction for us. Again, I talked about the scale, and we suddenly had people from right across our organisation coming across those conversations that they hadn't come across before. Number one, the important role that our leaders play. So our on the frontline leaders and our frontline support. So we, Michael talked before about, some of the ways he made sure his staff are engaged working from home. We did similar things, but some of as those pockets emerged of the type of calls we were dealing with, we had to think differently. So we have a number of mental health organisations that work very closely with us here at the ATO. And again, over the last 12 months, we've actually increased that work specifically for the early release of super, because we do that normally. It's not just COVID. And some of the work we've done with Thriving Minds and people like that to actually help us understand, what does a break look like? How do we think about, what sustainable numbers look like? What is it that actually we need to be looking for? And in a virtual world, how do you look for those signs? Because when someone's sitting next to you, you'd actually see far more or hear far more, as far as, even just the intonations of their conversation. So how do you transition that to a virtual world? So actually the role of the team leader for us became actually the most crucial role for us in our organisation. The support we needed to give them on, here are some other ways to interact, here are some other ways to question, how are you checking in, remembering they are everything to their team, and every one of their team members require things just a little bit differently. So there's no one size fits all. We haven't solved this. This is not something for us that, fantastic, here's a paper or here's a position, so we've solved it, what's next? For us, this is something that is going to continue to be a challenge. The results or the impacts of COVID on our community, so if you think about our business clients, our individual clients, it all has a flow and effect that's not going to stop once shops open and people get back to, the new normal. It is enduring. So there are long-term impacts of what we have seen this year. We already had a community in crisis in a number of areas, the bushfires, but equally businesses just not doing well. Our insolvency numbers had gone up. So those sorts of things were already being felt within the tax office. So for us, we don't think we're there yet. We do think we invested heavily and got some good results from some of those things, but we would still consider ourselves on the start of this journey, as far as how do we ensure the mental health of our staff who are dealing with people in crisis? How do we ensure the mental health of our staff when they themselves are going through personal challenges that potentially has a bigger impact? How do we think about how long, how many, how much of a conversation of a particular work type, and what's the impact of that? Some of that's longitudinal stuff. So it's something that we are on the early stages of the journey of. It's a wicked problem.
Indeed. Michael, I guess it's fairly similar for you?
Yeah, look, lots of similarities there. And one of the things that I, as I said up front, I changed roles at the end of August. So one of the things that I had seen from afar was how well the teams were coping and operating in engaging customers in really challenging circumstances. One of the key elements for me coming in was actually just to start having conversations also with our team leaders, our managers, about how they were going. So I know they were absolutely doing their best to support people and their teams. But in pockets, we had some really inexperienced team leaders. And so it's really about what support and engagement are we offering to those people, making sure that we're encouraging people to step away from work as well. I've got large numbers who are working from home. And it's just so easy to open the laptop, to check one more email, to get caught up on something. And around the same time, we've been rolling out new technology capabilities. So, we've got all of our people sitting with laptops. They've got Microsoft Teams, so they can chat, they can video at any time. And so really, it's then how do you find the balance between doing too much and doing, not doing enough, but also, a really strong message. When was the last time you had some time off? When was the last time you had a day off? Even if you are locked down at home and you're in Melbourne, you can't go anywhere, just take the day off. Have a day off. Put the laptop aside. And even, I sent a very subtle note to my leadership teams in Melbourne with the long weekend last weekend, saying, step away from everything. Don't look at it. Don't look at your emails. And then I took a little check to see, a little sideway check to make sure no one had gone online. But again, just to make sure that they were looking after themselves. Because, the last thing you need is people burning out that you're relying on to support a large number of frontline staff. So, my role I've seen is very much supporting my team leaders and managers to do the best they can do, so that they can then support their broader teams.
Thank you. And look, I think looking back is great, but let's look forward, because we're now living with COVID-19, or as it's now known, COVID normal. What does this entail for you? Is it resilience, adaptability, and of course, something that you guys are very flexible and adaptable with, which is legislative changes, which are ongoing. Michael, do you want to perhaps kick this off?
Sure. Look, as you said, it is a new environment we're in. We're still grappling with a mix of at home and in the office working, and that'll be a feature for us moving forward. I think the way that we've considered work will be adjusting and shifting as we move forward. Certainly using technology has been beneficial in terms of meetings and getting together, using things like Teams and Zoom earlier on and other platforms. Probably the big things for us moving forward, it's just continuing to focus on the volume and complexity of change. How are we supporting people through a changing environment? So there is, as you said, there's lots going on. We are supporting the JobKeeper program, and that has a number of changes through September and then January. The annual wage decisions from the Fair Work Commission this year was staggered over a number of date points. So we're supporting sort of those kind of changes. The government is flagging legislative change in our space. So they've been doing a lot of work in the industrial relations space and a number of working groups, and there's been certainly media about proposed legislative change coming into 2021. So really it is about how do we make sure that we are supporting our people, putting the right processes in place, similar to a lot of the things that Francis has said. How do we keep learning? How do we keep supporting people? How do we just, keep taking stock of where we're at and, recalibrating to a certain extent what's important. That the why we're here and what we do has shifted quite dramatically in some areas. And so there's an opportunity now for us to recalibrate some of that thinking and make sure that we're really aligned to purpose and really aligned to outcomes that we need to achieve. And that's an area that I'm focusing on at the moment with that forward lens.
Fantastic. Francis?
Look, I could just hit record and say, just like Michael said, a point that he made earlier, though, around making sure our people take time off and how do we make sure the environment doesn't actually stifle that. If I think of a couple of the measures, Michael mentioned Job Maker, early release of super. We've got a new one called Job Maker, not JobKeeper from before. All of those, actually, some of them have an end date of the 31st of December. Well, the ATO normally shuts down just over Christmas. So we're suddenly in a set of circumstances where we're actually going to be asking people not to even take their shutdown. So how do we make sure the environment that we are moving into does not actually take away from the things that we take for granted? Things like making sure wellbeing is managed by appropriate leave. So some of those. Probably for me, one of the other big things is the importance of innovation, the importance of continuous improvement through business process. Most people that work in frontline would say, if you spoke to 5 staff, they'd say we are insane for doing, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 things. And our staff have the answers to those things. So we actually need to be better at listening and more agile in moving. We always talk in the ATO about part of the job of our frontline staff and equally our managers, our support, is to actually stop the calls. And people say to me, that's insane. If I stop the calls, I won't have a job. And I'm like, you're not listening, because actually stop the calls that don't need to happen. Nobody in the world wants to says I want to ring the ATO today. Unfortunately, they don't have a choice, right? So what we want to do is create the space and move the noise. So the noise are the calls we don't need, and the space we create is to actually deal with the clients who are not calling us, because in fact, they're probably the ones we want to talk to. So for us, it's how do we create the curious mind? How do we foster the environment that actually rewards that sort of thinking and innovation to actually help us change what that status quo is for our work? Legislative change happens for us as a constant. For us, it's about remembering that change is BAU, and if we look at the last 6 months, every person that came and worked in that service delivery frontline environment, the number of approaches I've had saying, man, you guys run a tight ship, how can we be a part of that? It is about actually celebrating those things that we do really, really well and actually helping to create some improvements across the rest of the organisation because they've done well. But certainly the future is building on those things that we've successfully delivered.
Wow. And look, thank you both. I think Australians tend to, I'm going to put myself out there, take a negative view of government agencies as not having empathy and not truly caring and not really understanding what's going on. What I certainly saw from both of you today is the level and extent and the depth of which you've gone through, to prepare your people, but also in understanding the challenges that Australian citizens are having navigating through COVID, just as your people are having challenges navigating through COVID-19. We're all human. Dare I say it? Oh, goodness, I'm going to do it. We're all in this together, and we are. Australia is an island and we have to be in it together. So I can't thank you both enough for sharing your stories with our attendees today. Stay safe, stay well, and we'll see you next time. Thank you, Francis and Michael.